For over 100 years, textbooks called it the largest deer that ever lived. Its antlers stretched wider than a car. Its skeleton towered over modern elk in museum halls across the world. Visitors would walk in, look up, and feel genuinely small standing beneath it. Children stared in awe, absolutely certain they were looking at the biggest deer nature had ever created. But here's the twist almost nobody talks about. Megaloceros giganteus, the animal popularly nicknamed the Irish Elk, was never actually the largest deer in history. And the real story of what science eventually uncovered is stranger, messier, and far more fascinating than the myth that made it famous. Let's start with what made Megaloceros so legendary in the first place. This animal lived during the Pleistocene epoch, roaming across Europe and parts of Asia until it disappeared from the fossil record around 7,000 years ago. Its most jaw-dropping feature, the thing that made it instantly recognizable, was its antlers. A full rack could span nearly 3.5 meters from tip to tip and weigh as much as 40 kilograms. That is heavier than an adult human child, balanced on top of an animal's skull, supported by nothing but bone, muscle, and evolutionary momentum. When the first nearly complete skeletons were pulled out of Irish peat bogs during the 1700s, scientists were floored. Nothing alive at the time looked anything like it. So naturally, the assumption formed almost instantly. This had to be the largest deer species the planet had ever produced. But that assumption had a problem baked into it from the very beginning. And it took science a long time to catch up to that problem. Size in animals isn't measured by the most dramatic feature. It is measured by total body mass, shoulder height, and overall skeletal structure. Antlers, no matter how enormous, are not the same thing as body size. And once researchers actually began measuring Megaloceros properly, using leg bones and vertebrae instead of just marveling at its headgear, they discovered something that quietly contradicted a century of assumptions. Its body wasn't nearly as massive as everyone believed. Estimates place its body weight somewhere between 400 and 700 kilograms, depending on the specific individual and the study conducting the analysis. That is genuinely impressive for a deer. But record-breaking in terms of pure size? Not even close to certain. So if Megaloceros wasn't the biggest, then who actually holds that title? This is where the story shifts in a direction most people never expect, because the answer isn't hiding in a museum basement or locked away in a rare fossil collection. The answer might be walking through a forest right now, completely ignored by popular science simply because it doesn't come with dramatic, headline-grabbing antlers. Meet the moose, specifically the Alaska-Yukon moose, scientifically known as Alces giganteus, widely recognized as the largest living deer species on Earth today. A mature bull moose can weigh up to 700 kilograms, and in some documented cases, even more. It can stand over 2 meters tall at the shoulder, which is taller than most humans standing on a chair. That is taller, and in many verified comparisons, heavier than Megaloceros ever was. The moose doesn't need enormous antlers to prove its dominance in size because its entire body was built like a walking tank. Thick, dense bones, powerful, heavily developed muscle mass, a frame engineered by evolution to survive brutally cold winters and push through deep snow without slowing down. When scientists began directly comparing body mass and skeletal proportions between Megaloceros and modern moose populations using consistent, standardized methods, the results quietly rewrote what generations had assumed to be settled fact. The title of world's largest deer didn't belong to the extinct giant with the record-breaking antlers everyone remembered. It belonged to an animal still alive right now, wandering through the forests of Alaska, Yukon, and parts of Siberia, almost completely overlooked in this specific conversation. But that is only the first layer of this secret, because moose, as impressive as they are, aren't even the complete story either. Before we go further into the second twist, if this kind of deep dive into forgotten and misunderstood animal history is something you genuinely enjoy, now is the perfect moment to hit that subscribe button. This channel exists specifically to dig past popular myths and museum labels and show you exactly what the science actually found once researchers looked closer. There is a lot more coming after this video, and trust me, you do not want to miss what's next. All right, let's keep going, because the real twist in this story is still ahead of us. Here is where paleontology throws in another curveball that most documentaries completely skip over. Long before Megaloceros existed, and long before modern moose evolved into the form we recognize today, there was another deer relative stomping across the icy landscapes of North America. Its name was Cervalces scotti, commonly nicknamed the stag-moose. This animal lived during the last ice age, sharing its frozen world with woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and massive ground sloths that dwarfed anything alive today. Fossil evidence recovered from across North America suggests the stag moose stood remarkably tall, with several estimates placing its shoulder height and overall body bulk in direct competition with, and in some cases exceeding, both Megaloceros and modern moose populations. Its antlers looked genuinely strange to modern eyes, almost like an evolutionary compromise between a moose and an elk. But its body was clearly built for raw size and physical power rather than display. Now here comes the part that truly matters, the part that scientists spent decades carefully untangling behind the scenes. For a long time, comparing these ancient animals accurately was incredibly difficult because most available measurements came from incomplete, fragmented skeletons, a partial leg bone discovered in one location, a single skull fragment uncovered somewhere entirely different, decades apart. Paleontologists were essentially forced to reconstruct entire body proportions from scattered puzzle pieces, which meant early estimates were often wildly inconsistent from one research paper to the next. Some early reconstructions of Megaloceros actually exaggerated its overall size significantly because 19th century artists and scientists extrapolated body proportions from its dramatic antlers rather than from actual measured skeletal remains. In other words, the myth of Megaloceros being the undisputed biggest deer wasn't simply a case of public misunderstanding. It was partly baked directly into the scientific literature itself for well over a century. It wasn't until modern techniques finally arrived that researchers got an accurate, reliable picture of the truth. Things like CT scanning of fossilized bones to measure internal density, statistical modeling of body mass based on limb bone circumference, a method that has proven remarkably accurate across many species, and direct computer-assisted comparisons between multiple deer species using standardized measurement protocols instead of rough visual estimation. When the numbers were finally laid side by side using these modern tools, the truth became unmistakably clear. Megaloceros absolutely had the most impressive antlers of any deer species ever documented, living or extinct. Nothing else comes remotely close, not even today's largest moose. But in terms of raw body size, the category most people actually associate with the phrase biggest deer, it was competing in a genuinely crowded field, not standing alone at the very top the way popular culture had assumed for generations. There is also a fascinating side note here about why Megaloceros grew such enormous antlers in the first place, because that specific mystery ties directly into why people mistakenly assumed it was the biggest deer overall. For decades, scientists debated fiercely whether those massive antlers served purely as a display feature for mating competition, or whether they served some kind of practical survival purpose researchers hadn't identified yet. Extensive research eventually revealed that antler size in Megaloceros scaled disproportionately compared to overall body size, a biological pattern known as positive allometry. Essentially, as these deer grew slightly larger across successive generations, their antlers grew even faster and more dramatically, creating a runaway evolutionary effect driven almost entirely by sexual selection pressure. Bigger, more impressive antlers meant significantly more success attracting mates and intimidating rival males during breeding season. So evolution kept pushing that specific trait further and further, even without a matching proportional increase in overall body mass. This explains the strange disconnect perfectly. The antlers became legendary, instantly recognizable, and endlessly discussed. The body size, however, did not necessarily follow at the same accelerated pace. And that specific mismatch is exactly what fooled generations of scientists, museum curators, and casual visitors alike. So why did Megaloceros eventually go extinct if it wasn't even truly competing for the outright size record? This question has its own long and twisting scientific history worth exploring. For a long time, the leading theory blamed the antlers themselves, suggesting the animal had essentially evolved itself into an evolutionary corner, growing headgear so enormous and metabolically expensive that it eventually became a genuine survival liability. But more recent, more nuanced research complicates that once popular idea significantly. Climate change at the end of the last ice age dramatically altered vegetation patterns across Europe and Asia. The specific high-quality forage that Megaloceros needed each year to grow and maintain those enormous antlers became increasingly scarce as dense forests gradually replaced the open grasslands it depended on. Combined with mounting pressure from early human hunting populations spreading across the same territory, the species simply couldn't adapt quickly enough to these compounding pressures. It wasn't the antlers alone that caused its extinction directly. It was an entire ecosystem shifting rapidly beneath its feet, faster than evolution could reasonably respond. Now, let's bring this conversation back to the central question of the video, because there is one more important twist worth mentioning before we wrap things up. When people casually ask what the largest deer species of all time actually was, the honest, scientifically accurate answer turns out to be far more nuanced than a simple single ranking. If you're measuring strictly by antler span, nothing beats Megaloceros, not even remotely close, and that record likely stands untouched. If you're measuring by living body mass today, the Alaska-Yukon moose currently and clearly holds that title. And if you're including extinct relatives pulled from the broader fossil record, the stag-moose remains a serious, legitimate contender that rarely gets mentioned outside of specialized paleontology circles and academic journals. The biggest deer title isn't one single trophy sitting on one single museum shelf waiting to be claimed. It's actually split across several distinct categories that most popular science articles and viral social media posts never bothered to separate clearly, which is exactly how the Megaloceros myth managed to survive completely unchallenged for so many generations. Let's also talk briefly about how this misunderstanding spread so effectively in the first place, because that part of the story is almost as interesting as the biology itself. Early natural history museums competing for public attention and funding during the 18 and 1900s often prioritized dramatic visual displays over precise scientific accuracy. A skeleton with a 3.5-meter antler span mounted dramatically under bright lighting simply generated more public excitement, more newspaper coverage, and more paying visitors than a technically accurate but visually modest moose skeleton standing quietly in a corner. Illustrators working for popular science books and encyclopedias frequently exaggerated Megaloceros even further, sometimes shrinking surrounding human figures in comparative illustrations to make the antler span appear even more impossible and awe-inspiring than reality actually supported. This wasn't necessarily intentional deception in most cases. It was simply the natural result of visual spectacle consistently winning out over careful, methodical measurement, generation after generation, until the myth became so deeply embedded in popular culture that almost nobody thought to seriously question it. It's also worth mentioning how genetic research has recently added another fascinating layer to this entire story. DNA extracted from well-preserved Megaloceros remains found in Siberian permafrost has allowed researchers to trace its evolutionary relationships far more precisely than skeletal comparisons alone ever could. Surprisingly, this genetic evidence suggests Megaloceros was actually more closely related to modern fallow deer than to red deer or elk, despite its enormous size, making it look nothing like either living relative on the surface. This genetic surprise further reinforces just how misleading pure physical appearance can be when scientists try to draw conclusions about evolutionary history, body size records, or species relationships without deeper biological data to support those initial visual assumptions. What makes this entire story genuinely remarkable isn't simply that scientists were wrong for a while and eventually corrected course. That happens constantly throughout the history of paleontology as new evidence, better tools, and more complete fossil discoveries continue arriving. What makes this particular story remarkable is how a single dramatic, visually stunning feature, those massive sweeping antlers, was powerful enough to shape public perception for literal centuries, even influencing serious academic assumptions for decades before better measurement tools finally arrived to correct the historical record. It stands as a perfect example of how easily humans latch onto the single most visually striking detail of any subject and allow that one detail to define an entire creature in the public imagination, sometimes at the direct expense of the full, complicated, and genuinely more interesting picture. So the next time you walk through a natural history museum and see a skeleton with those iconic, wide, sweeping antlers proudly labeled as the biggest deer in history, you will know the real, complete story behind that label. Megaloceros wasn't a fraud, and this entire discovery isn't about tearing down a beloved prehistoric animal. It genuinely did possess the most spectacular antlers of any deer species known to science, a record that likely will never be broken by any living or extinct competitor. But the crown for the single largest deer overall has always been far more complicated, far more contested among researchers, and honestly far more interesting than the simple, tidy headline most of us grew up believing without question. Before we wrap up completely, if you made it this far into the video, that genuinely tells me you love uncovering the real science hiding behind these popular myths. And that is exactly what this entire channel is built around from the ground up. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the next deep dive, because there are so many more well-known facts out there that science has quietly overturned behind the scenes. And I am going to keep bringing them to you one carefully researched video at a time. Drop a comment letting me know which animal myth you want debunked next. Hit that like button if this video genuinely changed the way you'll look at that museum skeleton next time you see one. And I will see you in the next video.